This is a reading from the 12th chapter of Luke. Jesus said to his students, "That's why I'm telling you not to worry about your physical life, what you'll eat, or for your body, what you'll wear. For life is much more than eating, and the body is more than clothing. Take a look at the crows. They don't plant, they don't harvest, they don't store things away in cribs or barns. Yet God cares for them. You are considerably more valuable than birds. Besides which one of you, by fretting and fuming, can make himself 1 inch taller? Well, if you're worrying can't change a little thing like that, why wear yourself out over anything else? Now take a look at the lilies, how they do no knitting or sewing. Yet I'm telling you that not even Solomon, in all his finery, was ever dressed up like one of them. Well then, if God so outfits a plant that one day is growing in the field and the next is used for fuel, he'll do even more for you, you spiritual runts. The people of the world go tearing around after all these things, but your Father knows you need them. So set your heart on his movement, and such things will be fully supplied. Stop being so scared, my little flock. Your Father has decided to make you responsible for the movement. Sell what you own and give it with no strings attached. Make yourselves wallets that don't wear out, an unsurpassed spiritual treasure which thieves don't plunder nor worms consume. For your treasure and your heart are wrapped up together." That was from the
King James version.
The Cotton Patch translation, in case you spiritual runts were wondering about that. So I still vividly remember a conversation I had many years ago with a mother, Susan Hill, who stopped by my office at the meeting house one morning so that we could talk over some meeting business. Susan was an x-ray technician and worked odd hospital hours so that she could watch her girls during the day until her husband came home from his job, and then he watched the girls while she went to work. So when she came over to talk to me, she brought her 2 little girls, Dahlia and Josie. Susan brought some toys and some books, and the idea was that the girls could play quietly in the library while we talked. Did I mention that they were like 4 and 2 or something like that? Anyway, they could not play quietly in the library while we talked, at least not for more than 15 minutes. And so eventually we took our conversation out to the playground while Susan moved back and forth between a swing for one girl and a tire for the other, then the tire for the first and the rope ladder for the second, then the fort house for one and the swinging bar for the other. At one point, her older girl, Dahlia, climbed the rope ladder until she was about 5 feet above the ground, carefully turned around and said, "Mama, catch me." Although at first she couldn't make herself jump, it didn't take more than a few seconds before she mustered up the courage to fling herself at Susan's chest. And Susan caught her, of course, and hugged her and swung her down to the ground, where Dahlia uttered the refrain known so well to parents and babysitters all over the world, "Let's do it again." So she climbed up again and leapt out over space again, and Susan caught her again, and this went on for several minutes. Dahlia's faith was marvelous to see. Because of the way the fort house was set up, she sometimes leaped straight for Susan's neck, making contact, as far as I could tell, somewhere around the Adam's apple, but Susan caught her every time, and Dahlia never doubted that she would. I remember playing this same game when I was young. I remember how I had to screw my courage up to leap out over some vast gap, at least that's how it seemed, and how my dad would catch me. And my fear was never about whether he'd catch me, but only whether I could leap far enough. Until I got to be about 5 or 6 and he started to say, "You know, I think you're getting to be a little too big for this game." And then I just was too big for the game, and that was that. But it seems to me now that if my dad had miraculously kept getting stronger and stronger as he got older until eventually his power was at Superman levels, I wonder whether I could have kept playing the game. It seems to me that most of us probably outgrow this game right around the time we head off to school, which is where I learned that it was possible to run fast enough so that if you fell, you scraped the skin off your knee and got gravel and dirt embedded in your hands. In other words, it was about the same time that I got to be too big for the catch me game that I also began to learn that you could really hurt yourself if you fell. So maybe even if my dad could have caught my flying body all the way through high school, I think there would have come a time way earlier than that when I just would not have had the courage to leap out over space anymore. I think maybe I could only do it when I didn't know what the consequences of a failed leap would be. So I wonder where a 4-year-old does get the courage to leap out over 4 or 5 feet of space and trust her mother or father to catch her. Well, partly, I suppose, this is a game played only with decent parents, and I suppose it's from the experience that she already has of her parents, that they've been carrying her around all her life and they've never dropped her. And partly, I guess, because never having been dropped, she can't really understand what it means to fall 5 feet. She has experiences of her parents' trustworthiness. She's never experienced hitting the ground, and no one has yet told her, be careful, that's a dangerous thing to do, or you know it's going to hurt if you hit the ground. And maybe she hasn't seen yet another child fall off a Fort house and get hurt. So she doesn't have the experience of pain herself. She can't reason her way to it, and she hasn't learned it by education. So she has the courage to leap again and again, and the experience of being caught confirms her courage. I'm belaboring this point because I think it has something to do with why most of us are so unwilling to trust the words of Jesus with which I began. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying. For it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Those are extremely comforting words. But I don't know many people in my culture who live by them. They simply don't seem trustworthy. They go against everything we've been taught about where security actually comes from. But do they actually go against our experience? That's a more difficult question. I think most of us in the United States, and most of us in this meeting anyway, have grown up well enough off that we're kind of like a 4-year-old standing on a platform who doesn't ever learn whether her father or mother will catch her because she's too scared to ever leap out into space. By the time most of us are old enough really to worry about what we are to eat and what we are to drink and how we will be clothed, we have already been taught a long list of rules about the responsible ways to take care of those things. Get a job which pays a decent wage. Make sure you always pay yourself first so you always have some savings. Try to build enough money in your savings account that you could live off of it for 6 months. If you ever did lose your job, start saving for retirement early. I think there are just dozens and dozens of rules of that kind. And they box us in a way so that we can't see any way to security outside of that box of responsible management of money and property. But people who have no money or property are not boxed in quite that way. They get boxed in a different way. Their security doesn't come from money management, but from relationships. In college, I read a book called All Our Kin by the sociologist Carol Stack, which made the argument that one of the things that helps poor people survive in poverty is their rich network of family and friendship obligations. But that same network of obligations can keep them from making any permanent economic progress, so-called, since anyone who acquires any kind of surplus is usually called on to share it and never to save it. In other words, if one person manages to get a car, they are then called upon to give rides to all of their family members. And if giving a ride to one person to a hospital happens to conflict with a job interview, they give the ride to the person to the hospital, they fail to show up at the job interview, and they don't get the job. What saves them over and over again is also what stands in their way. It's interesting that the Bible doesn't tell us many rules about responsible management of money or property. The world of the Bible looks a lot more like the world of the poor, which Carol Stack discovered. And the Bible doesn't ever assume that if we just try hard enough, are responsible and smart enough, that we can control our lives. The Bible knows that we don't control the weather. We don't control the productivity of the fields. We don't control our neighbor. We don't control the death of a husband or a father, which is why the Bible lays out so carefully the obligations of family members, the obligations of neighbors, and even the obligations of strangers. But Bible has a host of rules for the help that you must give, are obligated to give. This passage from Deuteronomy 22 is one of my favorites. You shall not watch your neighbor's ox or sheep straying away and ignore them. You shall take them back to their owner. If the owner does not reside near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until the owner claims it. Then you shall return it. You shall do the same with a neighbor's donkey. You shall do the same with a neighbor's garment, and you shall do the same with anything else that your neighbor loses and you find. You may not withhold your help. You shall not see your neighbor's donkey or ox fallen on the road and ignore it. You shall help to lift it up. Elsewhere, in Exodus 23, there's also a rule that you must help lift even your enemy's fallen donkey and return your enemy's ox. Then there are all the rules about who must marry his brother's widow. And while these are horrifying to us on the one hand, because they point out that not only that a woman can almost never own property, but that she is herself most times a form of property, these rules are also an attempt to provide for the welfare of women. In a system where the only place for a woman to live is where her husband or her brother live, these laws attempt to find a place for a woman who has been thrust out of the system for reasons absolutely beyond her control. The place of women in the ancient Near East still seems brutal to me, and yet not so brutal as requiring that a living woman join her dead husband in his grave, as so many other cultures have required. Anyway, the biblical picture of economic security is one of family relationship and community obligation, and then overlaid above that, the requirements of justice. The rules which are meant to protect us not only from what we can't control, but from calamities we may also have had some hand in. Not only hunger, death, and the dissolution of a family, but also debt and the loss of family lands. That's why there are the laws about gleaning, about leaving produce in the fields for the poor, who are most times known as the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Laws about leaving some fruits in the fields for the poor to gather, about providing for the poor from any surplus, and that this provision is required from everyone who has a surplus. It seems to me that in those systems, not the one that we grew up in, but the systems of the poor and the systems of the Bible, persons are always in the position of testing out the idea of God's providence. Persons are always gathering the experience by which one could come to take Jesus seriously. about the lilies of the field, by which one could come to trust that God will provide for God's children. If we were not so largely, mostly middle-class persons of fortune, we also might have occasion to put God's providence to the test. Farmers do, and sailors and fisher folk, anyone whose job depends on the weather, on seasons, on natural cycles. Anyone who's been forced to endure a dry spell, a time of leanness and want, and had to put God to that test. When you think about it, the first Thanksgiving, if there actually was one, was a celebration of God's providence, of the grace by which the pilgrims survived, of their luck, and of the care of their neighbors, because Lord knows it did not celebrate the superior planning of a group which could not have known what to plan for. But most of us actually only test God's providence by accident. We lose a job, our home is flooded, we get kicked off our health insurance plan, and suddenly, instead of money management, we find that we are living off the kindness of friends and strangers, that people we barely know offer us a spare room, that people come forward to say, "Let me help," that people send cards and letters and inundate us with prayers and good wishes. I think of all my friends who have had those kinds of experiences, of finding themselves dependent on the care of strangers, as I also have. But I was thinking this morning about one of my professors in seminary who went for what they call a trial sermon at a Church of the Brethren congregation. When he was young, probably in his early to mid-20s, he was very nervous. It was one of his first times presenting a trial sermon. He had stayed up most of the night trying to make sure that his sermon was perfect. He was so nervous he hadn't eaten in the morning. They go through the worship service. It comes time for the trial sermon. He gets up to approach the podium and he faints. This is really not the way you want to start off your first trial sermon. So he wakes up lying on the floor, looking up at all the people whose congregation he hopes to pastor, who are now taking care of him, bringing him water, getting him seated. And after he recovers from the wobbliness, he goes on to give the trial sermon. I think they offered him the job, as I recall. But he remembered it as a lesson in God's providence, in God's care for him. I do wonder how we could teach ourselves to be as trusting of God's care without having to experience accidents and disasters. As Susan Hill's daughter Dahlia was trusting of her mother's willingness and ability to catch her. And I wonder if we could try it by little tests. Maybe we could choose one day in the week to be a true Sabbath on which we did no work. Maybe we could actually ask for help when we need help. Maybe we might enlarge our charitable giving to a little bit more than we think we can afford. I don't know. I just think there are probably 100 ways that we could push ourselves into making the small tests that would lead us to this larger truth, that God will provide for us, at least as well as for the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. Remembering, of course, that being provided for and being made wealthy are two vastly different things. But if, as Jesus suggests, our true security and our true treasure are in God's ability to catch us, what can I do to encourage myself to take the leap?